Welcome to Tuesday's Theme Talk for the International Affairs Conference. I am Nina Peluso, and I am thrilled to be introducing Patrick Lawrence. Patrick came in late last night on a boat, so we're excited to welcome him to the conference midweek.
And had a shower this morning on an off-shower day.
All right. Well, Patrick has had a long and storied...
Too loud?
Too loud? Oh, God. Can we turn it down? All right.
It's fine.
People are telling me it's fine. Is this best? Yes. All right. Okay. Currently, Patrick is a foreign affairs columnist at The Nation, and he has a long and storied history as a writer, foreign correspondent, columnist, and editor. He has contributed to such publications as the Far Eastern Economic Review, the International Herald Tribune, the New York Times, Business Week, Time, and many, many others. Patrick has published 5 books, 3 of which are available in the gift shop or directly available from him. The first is Time No Longer, Americans After the American Century. The second is Somebody Else's Century, a discussion of the East and West in a post-Western world. And the third is Japan, a reinterpretation. You can get those all at the gift store.
Bookstore.
Oh, bookstore. Yeah, they're all the same. He also has a number of other projects in the works, and I would highly recommend you ask him about those. The first is a project titled Shall We Begin Again, about the need for reinvention over restoration in a post-Trump era. The second is a more personal work on the Cold War that sits at the intersection of essay, history, and memoir. And the third is a collection of question and answer sessions that Patrick has been working on for The Nation. He's been conducting them with a set of carefully selected individuals across the spectrum and discussing the state of the world. We are thrilled to have Patrick at this year's conference, as his work sits squarely in the wheelhouse of examining America's place in the world from a multitude of perspectives. And with that, I give you Patrick Lawrence.
Are we good here? Yeah. I'm not even going to attempt to tell you what Liar? Higher? Louder. Okay. I'm often accused of being a mumbler, so I'm sorry. More?
Let him talk for a second and they'll adjust.
I don't like holding. Sorry. Okay, test. Okay. You know, I started to say I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here, and I won't even try for now. It's just amazing to me in many ways to see how you all are together. I guess I was about halfway from the boat to the hotel steps before I said yesterday, I don't want to speak to these people, I want to talk with them. I hope that's not too delicate a distinction, and I hope we can manage it. Anyway, it is always very interesting to talk about China, but especially now, our relations have long been voluble and changeable, and there are many critical moments in their history. Ours now, I will say without hesitation, seems to me to be one of the most critical. Cautiously, I'll suggest our ties with China now reach their most critical passage in my lifetime. And this puts us back to the midpoint of the last century. Newspaper stories always have headlines atop them, and being an old hack, a word newspaper people can use, but others cannot. Irish can tell Irish jokes, right? I'll give you my headline, Seeing China as It Is. I stole it from my last book but one, Somebody Else's Century, East and West in a Post-Western World. In that book, I got maybe a little too clever one morning, and I coined the phrase AAII, Asia as it is, right? And then I even went further and said A2I2. It means simply Asia as it is, right? And that is something quite different from Asia as we see it and think it is. That's the topic of the book. It's the same in spades when we look across to and think about China. Headlines often have subheads, and mine today will make the point well enough. Seeing China as it is, recovering our sight. Our relations are in grave trouble, to put the point another way, and hardly am I alone in that observation. And blindness, I think, is our most fundamental affliction. This puts China in some trouble in some respects. There's no question about that. Especially on the trade and investment side, I find China probably less vulnerable in other spheres. But we Americans are landed in far worse trouble because of our troubled relations with China. China's making some mistakes. I'm not a sort of Peking Review reading Sinophile, but I think we're making most of them at this point, in my view. Most of the shortcomings in understandings are ours. I remember my days in Japan dealing with these Gaimosho people, foreign ministry people. These people know America maybe as well as any of us in this room, right? They're careerists, right? It's just Asian bureaucratic tradition. They know us, right? The misunderstandings, it seems to me, belong mostly on this side of the ocean. We will lose far more if things worsen from here, and it follows that we have most of the work to do. I want to explain today some of what this work consists of, some things we need urgently to do and not do, I would say. In our current circumstances, these things may strike you as far too distant to achieve, but as I'll try to demonstrate, they aren't. We've been there before, if sometimes just briefly. Before going any further, I want to say something about President Trump. Fully aware that I'm probably at risk of offending a mass gathering of trumpets and trumpettes. I don't know why I have that impression. Trump is worsening the U.S.-China relationship as we speak. There is no question of this. But Trump, as in so many other cases, is a consequence, not cause. Trump's mistakes are the logical outcome, maybe the worst of the mistakes, but the logical outcome of many, many years of mistakes made by others upon whom we are not inclined to place so much blame as we do on Donald Trump. It's trying to understand these mistakes, if only today in broad outline, so we can open the door to correcting them. The only useful starting point in any endeavor is always the same, and I reckon everybody in this room knows this. One must begin with a clear recognition of where one is, however difficult or bitter it may be to accept this. I've divided my remarks into three parts, as I ordered my thoughts, it seemed the best way to get into an immense subject without losing control of it and making it as easy for you as possible to follow the line of logic. I'll first consider the US-China relationship as we have it now and how it got there. So present and some history. We've tried many approaches to China since the 1949 revolution. There's lots of variety in the strategies of different administrations. But there are a couple of unifying factors that make them all one. They are all marked by one or another degree of misapprehension, and forgive me, I must use the word delusion. I'll then put to you my thoughts on just what China is in the year 2018 and where it is going. Where it is going at a speed one can hardly believe sometimes, and what a healthy, constructive relationship with China would look like. This last point is important to me. Having shared my assessment of bilateral ties as they are now, or at least hinted at what I'm about to put to you, you might assume I'm a sour, hyper-critical sort whose starting point is that America never does anything right. Please don't make that assumption. I take a very critical view of U.S. foreign policy as a whole, this is for sure. But I think a sound, thought-through, universally beneficial relationship with China is without any question entirely possible and within our capacities. Let's look at that briefly in the second part of my talk. As I sometimes tell readers in my columns, look for the optimism buried in the apparent pessimism. We can do better is my most fundamental thought, and in contexts far removed from this one, but it applies to China certainly. I'll conclude my remarks, my third part, with a few observations about what is necessary if we're to achieve the kind of relationship I'm certain we can. We have to do certain things and we have to stop doing certain things. This involves certain recognitions Americans have so far resisted. It requires a new way of thinking and then seeing and acting. Here I'll give one example of each so you have an idea of where we're headed. Parity between West and non-West is a 21st century imperative, in my view. It is inevitable. Taking my date from da Gama's first landing in Calicut in 1498, this means a 500-year era of history is ending and something else is beginning. We have to recognize this. Flinching, as is almost always the case, doesn't get one anywhere. Seeing from the perspective of others, this is another 21st century imperative. And it is something we Americans must learn to do. We are not very good at this. History has been such that we haven't had to cultivate this capacity. We need to do so now if we're going to do it all well in our new century. Boutros Ghali, name from the past, after the Americans sabotaged his reappointment for a second term as Secretary General at the UN, he was quite a cultivated fellow, Ghali. Finished a memoir with the most interesting observation. Diplomacy is for weak nations, he wrote. The strong have no need of it. It's pithy and true in a way one wishes it weren't. But I've taken recently to distinguishing between strong nations and the merely powerful. And I can elaborate on this when we exchange questions and answers, if you like. Here, I'll say merely that we are unquestionably a powerful nation, the most powerful. But I don't think we are so strong as we like to imagine ourselves to be. China is accumulating power, yes. It is beyond question a strong nation by my definition. Anyway, part one, to begin at the beginning. Our relations with China are nothing if not a long and winding road. When expansionist Europeans disrupted the Asia's Sino-centric order in the 19th century, Americans were participants. U.S. naval vessels patrolled the Yangtze to protect American interests for nearly 100 years, beginning in 1854, a practice that stopped only in 1941 for the obvious reason. We were allies against Imperial Japan, but we were aggressively opposed to the 1949 revolution. We fought each other in Korea and took opposite sides in Vietnam. Kissinger and Nixon, working with Zhou Enlai and Mao, managed a great turn in relations. Then came Deng's reforms, which we greeted with obvious enthusiasm. Coming to the present, the Clinton administration aspired to entice China into the emerging post-Cold War order, which we mistook to be our unipolar order, the end of history bit, remember that? By giving it a lot of what it wanted. We would prosper together, the US-China fusion theory, I gather it is called. In time, China would become more like us, a phrase anyone who covers Asia knows well, right? As a description of our expectations. China has indeed become a responsible global citizen, there's no question of this, but it is in no wise like us, and more important, I think, has no desire to be like us. Fusion, I think you'll agree, is not exactly our term these days. With Bush II, we had glimpses of the hostility to come. I remember this incident because I had to write a column on it within 36 hours. George W. was a couple of weeks in office when the Hainan incident, if you recall, took place. An American spy plane was forced down, very messy situation. It was a harbinger. The supine, weak China was long, long gone. And as of then, Deng's thought that China must courteously obscure its growing power in the name of economic development was on the way out. That was the Bush II period. The Obama administration decided to make China explicitly an adversary. Susan Rice and others now write opinion pieces critical of Trump's emerging strategy, and fair enough as far as it goes. But Obama and his people made more mistakes than you've had hot dinners, as the English say. The pivot to Asia, a phrase I always found risible, amounted to neo-containment. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was at bottom a strategic instrument before it was a trade or regulatory plan, and I didn't even like it as the latter. In 2011, exactly a decade after the September 11th events, November 2011, a decade and 2 months, Obama gave a speech in the Australian Parliament I still have trouble believing. It was in essence a full-dress rendering of Bush II's with us or with the enemy position after September 11 for frame of reference being the People's Republic. In an instant, he put Australia, and by extension all of Asia, including many of our allies, bang on the spot in an impossible position. It has not gone well for Washington, to put the point politely. Now Trump is trying on a policy based on economic nationalism and bullying that simply cannot work, as most economists will require a little more than a minute to tell you. It is ignorant of the most basic attributes of 21st century global trade, production, and supply chains being prime examples. It is a refusal to recognize that both the US and China are too globalized and interdependent to attempt any such simplistic remedy. It's some kind of haywire lunge for a world that long ago left us. But we should not be mistaken. There are things to remedy. It is now clear that the we in Clinton's "we will prosper together" included American corporations, but not necessarily American workers. This has created a very real problem. Whatever one thinks of Trump's proposed response to it. The argument is made that Trump's real adversaries here are the very corporations that I just mentioned, for they have been fully complicit in producing the problems we now have in the relationship on the economic side. As I just said, there are some, certainly. By some estimates, up to half of China's merchandise exports to the US markets are sent across the Pacific by subsidiaries of American companies. I'm not a trade economist, but where in the world does that land us? It's a tangled web, and Trump can hardly be said to have woven it alone. Earlier this year, the Defense Department issued a new strategic guideline declaring that our military focus will now shift to China and Russia as our most dangerous threats. It's the same in both cases. You can hear Chinese or Russian officials refer to us as our partners. On the same day, we call them the enemy or our adversaries. Here I'm going to quote Chas Freeman, distinguished diplomat. I think he translated for Mao for Nixon when Nixon met Mao. Remarkable career. Washington is awash in xenophobia, he warned in a recent speech. Our political elite has now embraced a cartoonish vision of China as an economic pickpocket, a military predator, and would-be exporter of authoritarianism. In such descriptions, it is hard not to discern the faint reek of the yellow peril paranoia that gripped this country a little more than 100 years ago. A senior official in Washington suggested not long ago, earlier this year, that all Chinese professors, students, and scientifically trained people in this country should be considered potential spies. The saddest part of that little note, it won applause on Capitol Hill. Delusion and misapprehension, they are threaded all through this brief précis of American views, policy, and behavior toward China. So is all the scapegoating for our self-inflicted problems, which is quite a shameful thing to witness if you happen to be living and working among Asians at the other end of the Pacific when it comes across. I remember these experiences when I was in Japan in the 80s and 90s. Having lived in the non-West, primarily in Asia, for just short of 3 decades, I really do have to marvel at how wrong we have got this. One either laughs or does the other thing, and I'm often closer to the other thing given, as I believe, the Trans-Pacific relationship, specifically with China, how we understand it and what we do, presents the single most momentous question we face in the 21st century. It would be hard to limit an estimate of how much hangs upon it. I want to begin now talking about just what China is today, my China as it is, by mentioning a passage in the New Testament. Maybe some of you know Matthew 15:11. Very roughly paraphrased, Jesus tells his disciples in response to the Pharisees, "He who would defile another does not defile the other. It is he who would defile another who is defiled," right? It is what comes out of your mouth, not what goes into it, if you recall the passage. I love that passage. I confess I sometimes find it very handy after my columns come out in the social media. I mention it here because I think we have a variant in the current American intent toward China. Countering China, containing China, marginalizing China, isolating China, these thoughts have long been common in the American discourse and are common even now. They are impossible dreams. To propose isolating China is even more fantastic than trying to isolate the whole of continental Europe. He who would marginalize another will marginalize himself. This is my variant on Matthew. A quick example to bring it right down to the ground is to be found in China's launch of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank a few years ago. You may not know about it. It's an alternative World Bank, Asian Development Bank mechanism, 50 billion in capitalization, just like that. One key point in it is to lend to underdeveloped nations without IMF or World Bank conditionality, which is a very tough thing for developing nations to take on. Right? Treasury and the Hillary Clinton State Department determined to ignore China's invitation to the United States to join the AAIB. They thought this would be an effective counter. As Britain, Canada, Germany, and numerous other allies flocked to join Australia, all the Southeast Asians, it became a monumental embarrassment. We still haven't eaten enough humble pie to join, leaving us the very odd man out. So he who would marginalize is himself marginalized. China today, the Chinese economy as we have it is worth about $12 trillion. This compares to our 18.5 trillion. Pretty respectable considering. If we measure according to purchasing power parity, PPP, which some economists think is worthwhile to do, China's GDP comes out to $25 trillion, larger than America's. By any measure, it is growing at triple our rate. If you have an economy like Laos and it's growing at a fantastic 8% or something, well, it's 8% of that, right? But we're now talking about triple the rate of an economy that is 2/3 the size of our economy. Right? It starts to matter. It is no longer t-shirts and plastic flowers, of course. China is an eager importer of technology, will remain one, but it is also now an exporter. It spends about 1/5 of what the entire world puts into R&D every year. It originates about 1/3 of new patents every year. By 2025, It will have more people trained in science and technology than all Western nations combined. By that I mean the OECD members. China has plans, of course. 2025 is to be an important year when it proposes to be a global leader in key industries designated in its China 2025 plan. And I have to say, it reminds me of nothing more than Japan in the 60s and 70s, and we know the end of that story. Then there is the Belt and Road Initiative, by which China wants to connect, or reconnect, if you like, the old Silk Road imagery, and frankly, I don't. The Eurasian landmass. There are something like 17, they want to go from Shanghai to Lisbon, with interconnectedness. There are something like 1,700 BRI projects already underway. There's been a lot of comment in the media about Belt and Road, most of it negative. And I'm happy to take this up when we converse at the conclusion of my remarks. Here I want to stay with the core thoughts of China as it is. I remember a long sojourn in China as I researched the Chinese sections of Somebody Else's Century, the book I mentioned earlier. The astonishing energy and focus on advancing the nation simply could not be accounted for in economic terms alone. There had to be other explanations. This was my deepest conviction. There was some deeper drive, psychological or psychosocial, if you like. It runs like a deep submerged stream among the Chinese, and I will return to that point. Here, I mean simply to say China amounts today to a vast field of aspiration. That's a phrase I came up with when I finished the book research, and someone back in Hong Kong asked me the simple and simply impossible question, what did you think of China? Xi Jinping, his noted speech at the 19th Party Congress last year marked a very, very major turn. It was the mainland's announcement that it intends to take its place as a regional power and soon enough a global power. There's simply no stopping this. It's history's wheel turning, not more and not less. So we come to the core question. How are we to take this? So far, as I've already hinted fairly strongly, I think we have the frame wrong. We see China's emergence as a threat or the forcing of a contest. Our thinking is zero-sum, as we find in so many other spheres. What China gains, we will lose. With us or with China, as Obama boldly and I think very unkindly told the Australians, amounts to narcissistic myopia. I detect a deep insecurity and a lot of nostalgia buried in that kind of bold bravado. We are talking among ourselves about the Thucydides trap, the inevitability of conflict when a new great power arises next to an established one. This kind of thing already has us in trouble, and it is going to get us into more if we continue in this line. There can't be any other outcome. China's emergence as a regional and global power is a challenge. Absolutely it is. This can come as no surprise because history is never short of challenges. But it is not a challenge to confront, I argue, or to turn, certainly not to turn back. That's just out of the question. But not to confront, I would say. The challenge is to find opportunities in the soil of an unfamiliar landscape. It is to advance imaginatively into a new time, confident of our competence to do so. It is to see opportunity whenever it is there instead of an incessant perception of threat, a word I grow so tired of I can hardly bear it. It is to remain game, in a word, to be aware of the past, but never its prisoner. This question of the past is a problem in a couple of ways, and I'll take up one now. We tend to judge China's intent according to the patterns set when great powers arose in the 19th century. I guess it's natural enough to do that. But again, humanity has known nothing like what we now watch for half a millennium. The past is not going to be so reliable a guide. Precedent, not so strict a professor. We fear China's intent to force its influence and values on others, interventions and intrusions on the way. To me, this is merely to hold a mirror to ourselves. This was the character of 19th century Western expansionism. There is no sign Beijing has any such aspirations. Empire building and all that goes with it will not figure in the non-West's priorities as it rises to parity with the West. I wish we could see that and see that we are simply in another time. Zhou Enlai was 57 and China a struggling 6-year-old when he articulated the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence at the famous Non-Aligned Conference in Bandung in 1955. Territorial integrity, non-interference, mutual respect, recognition of equality, and so on. These were the 5 principles. China's record during the Cold War decades is very far from spotless. I doubt anyone's is. But there is every indication Beijing has not forgotten these principles. They are reflected in its Belt and Road Initiative and in its diplomacy and statecraft, of which there are many, many examples. Xi's vision is clear. Our prosperity is best achieved in a stable international order and by promoting the prosperity and well-being of others as well as ourselves. Beijing is a strong supporter of the UN and international law. As the Clinton administration wanted, it has made itself a constructive participant in the global order. It has no record of interventions in the post-cultural revolution period. It is startling to note that while we assiduously look for flaws that might emerge in China's grand strategy, and I think we can legitimately call Belt and Road and so on a grand strategy, we have no strategy of our own. I was struck a while ago as I read a New York Times piece explaining that while China is building railroads, power grids, ports, and the like, everywhere from Laos to Kenya, these projects may cause this, that, or the other problem. I had to pause at the breakfast table. A railroad in Laos. When was the last time we built a railroad in Laos? I'll leave that point where it is. Grousing is not a strategy. I see immense room for a constructive relationship with China, as I've already said, and I am not alone in this. And I wish those shaping and executing our policies could see more of it too. The number of things we could accomplish together is difficult to enumerate, the list being as long as it is. Peace in Northeast Asia being a perfectly prime example right in front of us. There are problems now in bilateral ties, yes, of course. Given the astonishing pace of China's advance, it would make no sense if there weren't. But I see none as insurmountable or cause for open conflict or some new grand, document from the Pentagon. None that aren't perfectly manageable to keep. I'm not going to give you a lot of technocratic detail here. It's not what I'm that interested in doing. We need simply to set up mechanisms to address these problems. New mechanisms because new problems. These might be bilateral in some cases or multilateral in others if other nations share the same difficulties with China we do in this or that area. Trade and investment, regional security, specifically the South China Sea problem, which is actually not a problem other than to the extent we wish to make it one. Or diplomacy in Northeast Asia, as just mentioned. We need to define where we are and set out to find solutions, creating what devices we find we need along the way. There is no shred of doubt in my mind that the Chinese would be fully on for such a sensible approach. But we're not there yet. We're missing out. Of all the things people lose in the course of life and nations in the course of history, it often seems to me lost opportunity is very high on the list. I'll finish this section of my remarks with a few quotations and then come to some conclusions. These three all make roughly the same point, and I will read them in the chronological order they were stated, and it's not a quiz, don't worry. 1, if we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. An interesting take on the Wilsonian thought, right? 2, the United States needs urgently to come to grips with the reality of China, and I can say that this morning, and you'll be amazed how old that remark is. 3, there are essential differences between China and the United States, ellipsis. However, the two sides agree that countries, regardless of their social systems, should conduct their relations on the principle of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, non-aggression against other states, non-intervention, etc. You will recognize those. They're Zhou Enlai's phrases in Bandung. First quotation belongs to Kennedy during his presidency. I speculate a somewhat chastened Kennedy for one or another reason. The second is Richard Nixon's early in his first term. That puts it around 1968 or 1969. It's urgent we come to terms with China. The third is taken from the Shanghai Communique Nixon and Mao signed in February 1972. I don't think much more need be said. We can do now what may seem impossible, and since I'm a hack, I will say, what our media urge us to consider impossible, we've been there before, and we can get there again. I'll finish up by addressing a few things, among very many, that I think we need to do or stop doing to get to a new place in our ties with China. We suffer a terrible jealousy of a predominance in the Pacific that is gone and will never come back. America has a lot of frontage on the Pacific Lake, and no one, not even the Chinese, wish it were otherwise. The message isn't go away, your time is done. It's move over. There are others here. Nostalgia is something I have long nursed a real distaste for. It's partly personal. My father, whom I honor, was hopelessly nostalgic for things as they were during their childhood. I can't tell you how tedious that used to get. Eventually, I concluded two things. One, nostalgia is a form of depression. It is a refusal to accept life as it is. Two, it denies the nostalgist access to the present. He can't act autonomously. He cannot activate his imagination such that he can live creatively in response to new circumstances. That's part of what makes a nation strong. Respond to new circumstances. Be confident enough to respond to new circumstances, I should say, right? It's the same in our context. So long as we entertain a nostalgia for a past across the Pacific that is indeed past and not returning, we will deprive ourselves access to the 21st century, and that is exactly what we are doing now. We are in the process of losing out on a settlement in Korea. You wouldn't believe, nowhere in our media will you read this, but you wouldn't believe how elaborate the plans are between the Russians, who have an underdeveloped Far East, North Korea, South Korea, and China, to develop North Korea and bring it into a regional sort of hub economy. It's just extraordinary. We're absent without leave, right? That shouldn't be. Asians are not waiting for our new era. They are reaching out with their arms to embrace it. They are creating it every day themselves with that remarkable drive I mentioned earlier. We seem only to flinch by contrast, and I've already given you my assessment of how far flinching gets us. To make a second point, I'll borrow a phrase from the late Karl Schorska, the Princeton scholar I had the privilege of making a friend of very late in his life. We have to think with history. We have no habit of this, and it won't do in our time. Our understanding of Asians is hopelessly two-dimensional. As Kenzaburo Oi, the Japanese Nobelist in literature, once told me in a conversation, you Americans know the Japanese for their tea ceremony, and you know us for all our Hondas, but you don't know anything in the middle. And with a palpable sadness, he said, that's where we live. It's the same across Asia, and certainly it is so in the case of the Chinese. Anyone who has walked to and fro in the mainland understands that the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties that followed were the day before yesterday to the Chinese sensibility. The 19th century was the time of their great wound, we can call it, I think. We need to understand this. As I suggested earlier, we can't understand what propels the Chinese so powerfully unless we do. A related and more practical point. China is rising, gaining in wealth, skills, and much more. But we need to see it, once again, historically. I think at the time Nixon negotiated with Mao, the Chinese economy was slightly larger than Washington, D.C.'s. We need to understand it as a developing nation. It is emerging from its long humiliations, but it still has the consciousness of itself of a struggling nation. What I call a culture of poverty is still very evident on the mainland, so is poverty. This will change, but it takes time. I mentioned we cannot enter into the trade question as with technocratic statistics as our guide. a $12 billion economy, a $1 trillion economy, an $18 trillion economy, okay, 2/3. That's not all there is to the story. We are not equals in many, many, many ways, right? I mentioned earlier the capacity to see from the perspective of others. This is such a case where it's important. As to thinking with history, one little sidelight here, we might remind ourselves of our own time as a developing nation. Well toward the end of the 19th century, our leaders in Washington boasted defiantly that we would maintain the highest tariff walls our industries may require until they are as strong as we want them to be. So we are not today confronted with some unprecedented pattern in development economics. China's in an adjustment period. It needs to make the adjustments, but we have to understand how it looks from their perspective and urge them at a reasonable pace, right? Thinking with history, I can't possibly overstate how important I came to rate this habit during my years of living and working in the non-West. My final point has to do with questions of modernization and westernization. There's a knot to untie here, but I don't think it'll be too difficult to do so. In the 19th century, Asians and all the rest of us made a very big mistake. For reasons a grasp of history makes easy to understand, these two things were hopelessly confused. They were taken to mean the same thing. To modernize, you must westernize. A great erasing ensued in the non-West. If it was Asian, it was inferior. If it was Western, it was superior. And we must match the West by following them in all ways. Parenthetically, it made it rather nice if you were collecting Chinese antiques in my time, because the Chinese didn't want them, right? Now they love them, but it'll go to a point I'm about to make. All manner of unfortunate consequences arrived from this confusion, and I'll single out one to make my point. As Asia began to make itself modern Asia, it abandoned its traditional understanding of mankind as embedded in nature, a single part in harmony with a larger whole. Just think of one of those splendid Chinese landscapes where the little scholar's hut is way in the corner of this, that tells the story, right? It sought dominion over all of nature, just as we have, fundamentally by way of a radical misinterpretation of Genesis and Psalm 8. All God has given us is ours, over which to exert our mastery. We know the results in the rush to westernize, and especially after 1945, Japan made itself an environmental calamity, concreting every speck of land it could, polluting its waters and skies in its compulsive drive to catch up, as the common phrase put it. China has been, if anything, worse. During my last long stay in Beijing, I found myself marveling that friends would be raising their children in such an environment just because they were making heavy money in financial services or something. I found it very odd. Right? I don't have children, but I couldn't put that together. I recall a flight from New York to Hong Kong that stopped in Beijing. This was just a few years ago. The connecting flight couldn't take off for the smog on the runways. We had to overnight in an airport hotel. It's not an uncommon story. In our time, maybe since the late 80s or early 90s, things have begun to change in the most interesting way. I first detected this in Japan, which is actually doing the Japan sections of that same book. I first detected, which is in keeping with the historical pattern concerning development questions, the Japanese are often first. Asians today are reconnecting with their own traditions on the question of humanity's place in nature. It's quite stirring when you come upon examples of this. And the Japanese are very mindful of what they're doing in just the terms I'm talking about. At bottom, there is a question of identity, the recovery of a discarded self. The same is true in China. It still has considerable problems before mastering its environmental degradations. A report came out last week noting this. But at the same time, it is making itself a global leader in environmental technologies. I don't think this is happenstance. I think there's something to be read into that. We should grasp the lesson. Asia now understands. To modernize does not mean to westernize. They don't have that ambition anymore. This is a pretty big reality for us to take on. It signals a very fundamental recentering of the Asian consciousness. We can call it the re-Asianization of Asia, if you like. It will matter in numerous respects other than environmentalism. And in closing, I'll relate what I think is one of the larger of these. It concerns politics, a subject we need to reflect carefully upon so as to alter our misplaced expectations in a way I think is also among our imperatives. Some years ago, a Bengali scholar named Partha Chatterjee, really an excellent scholar, good mind, gave us the term governmental technologies. The subtitle of his book was Politics in Most of the World. And this was his subject, how it is in most of the world. His intent with this term governmental technologies was to address the matter of political legitimacy in our time. Legitimacy, he observed, flows less now, especially in the non-Western world, from participatory political processes and more from an administration's capacity to deliver prosperity, security, basic services, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and the like to its citizens. I don't like that thought, given my education, training, and fundamental assumptions as a Westerner, but I feel called upon to accept the reality of Chatterjee describes. My fundamental assumptions about participatory politics and so forth may turn out to be the luxuries of someone who was raised amid the wealth of the West. I think we need to understand this as part of the re-Asianization of Asia. That's the right context in which to think about Chatterjee's point. The role of the state, the nature of civic participation, the place of private investment, multi-party politics, the centralization of domestic power, these and other such matters derive from different traditions. They are inevitably going to come out differently on the ground. And we need to bring this thought to our effort to understand China as it is. Just one other thought. Simple observation. I do some ghostwriting, okay? It's always very interesting work. You meet all variety of people. There are different kinds of engagements, as these things are called. But in every one, it is essential to develop a certain intimacy with your client because he's talking through you, right? You're not to diminish the craft, but you're essentially a ventriloquist dummy sitting on his knee, right? When I do, I find the same thing every time. People among us who want to assert themselves constructively and share what they know with the world so often do so with the intent of making it better. There is a prevalent assumption among us, if my experience is any guide, that little microscopic view, that people understand we need to make it better because we live in one that must be made a lot better than it is if we're going to do well in the 21st century. We are in a time that requires of us a lot of work. And in my exposure, not only in the ghosting, but a lot of people understand this. I don't find this reflected in our institutions, and I certainly don't find it reflected in those who make our foreign policies. They seem intent on holding on to something that is one cannot hold on to. I think this is perfectly evident when we consider our trans-Pacific doings, especially our poor understanding of China and all the richness that we could achieve if we were able to see straight across the ocean. It's my hope and my source of optimism of what comes over to some as pessimism, that there are enough of us who think similarly that we're going to get this done. And I will leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a 10-minute break today, and then we'll come back for our Q&A. I will remind you that there's a box to stage left over here for panel questions at the end of the week.